will not happen again. So thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today. My name is Kathleen Yost. I am one of the co-leads of this core. I'm at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and I direct the Survey Research Center here, which is an enterprise-wide research core. I'm going to be joined today. We're going to have three speakers today. The other co-lead is Catherine Oloda-Yimbo, and she is our expert. I'm the expert in quantitative methodology and measures. Dr. Oloda-Yimbo is going to be our speaker today, talking about things to think about when we're doing international projects. And then also joining today is Mary Ellen Young, who is our expert in qualitative methodology. Additional members are Opiemi Bolajoko, Allison Griswold, and then our community representative is Senator Tony Hill, and our MPI liaison is Falake Adedina. So our mission is to support the development and use of best practices for research design, measures, and customized data collection for eye care research projects. So we have three goals, and we're going to talk about each of these goals in detail. And many of you, if you've joined this eye care symposium, some of this will be familiar, but we're going to dive a lot deeper because we have more time today with our webinar. So the goals are to establish standard operating procedures tailored to the eye care population for research design, including development, validation, translation, implementation, and interpretation of qualitative and quantitative study measures. Review and consult on data collection approaches for eye care research project, and this is probably where we spend most of our time is with goal number 2. And then collaborate with eye care investigators to disseminate best practices, a methodology, and measures for studies in prostate cancer in Black men. So going through these in order. So goal 1, these are the things that we've accomplished so far in our eye care project. One was to set up an operations manual, and that was done very early on, and it's a guiding document for our work. Also, we set up regular meetings. We meet monthly. We can meet more frequently if needed to assist investigators with their work. And then to develop SOPs, we have 2 SOPs developed. One is the criteria for methodology and measurement, and it's technically an SOP, but it also has a bit of a best practices document. So it also can be direct us in that respect as well. And that one's been completed. And then the core outcome set, and this isn't really completed because it's a living document. What this is we are really, one of our main objectives is to harmonize and standardize measures across the consortium. So we want to make sure that all the different pilot projects and full projects are measuring common data elements in a similar way so that we can compare across studies. It's really complicated if we have one group using a particular measure, for example, of educational status, and another pilot project or full project using a completely different measure of educational status, then it's hard to compare across the studies. So we're trying to harmonize those measures. And it's a living document because we've already come up with the list of questions that we anticipated were going to be very common. But then as the projects come along, they'll say, oh, well, I need a measure of digital literacy. Then we will investigate and help that investigator identify a good standard measure for digital literacy, and we will add that to the outcome set. So I'm going to take a little bit of time talking a bit more about that common outcome set. So we have identified minimum required elements that we encourage all pilot projects and full projects to use. These are going to be basic information collected on all participants, and that's regardless of whether it is a quantitative survey or a qualitative survey or study. There's just some basic information that we should know in order to describe who the sample is. This will also allow comparison across studies, and we've been mindful of other groups who have common data elements like the NIH. When you're submitting an application for NIH funding, there's a set of common data elements that they would like you to use. And this is, again, it's just good practice. And we have identified a tiered structure because this can be a little bit overwhelming. The common data elements can be long and burdensome to participants, so we want to keep it very, very short. And we've come up with a tiered structure to help guide what elements should be sort of almost required and then which ones are optional. So this is an example of our tiered structure. So the minimum requirements are really the basics things. They're race and ethnicity. So of course, these are all going to be Black men, but they could have other races. So that's why we include a race question. They can mark all that apply. Age, education, overall health, quality of life, health history. Those are just examples of what would be considered minimum required elements. Then we get into the yellow section of this funnel, and this is where they're encouraged, they're strongly encouraged that investigators consider these. These are going to be things like social economic status, social determinants of health, some symptoms and treatment side effects, comorbidities, their access to care, maybe some functional measures like urinary function or sexual functioning. Again, depending on the research question being asked, those may be relevant and important to the research study. Then there are these very specific project elements that will probably only make sense in one particular pilot project or one particular full project. And the examples I gave here would be comfort with home-based chemotherapy. So that's going to be very specific to a study on delivering chemotherapy in a in a decentralized study. Or for example, acceptability of a virtual app. Of course, that's only going to be relevant to studies that are involving an app. So hopefully this tiered structure will help investigators think about how to structure their measures for their population. For goal 2, again, this is where we spend most of our actual hours as a core. And it's in reviewing and consulting on pilot projects and full projects. So thank you, Emelina, for pulling together this table. As I say, it's hard, you have to keep, it's hard to keep the players straight without a scorecard. So this is a nice scorecard to help us keep track of the switching names from pilots to full projects and also who is involved in the studies. So what we like to do is when a study team approaches us and there is a measurement component to it, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, we want to embed one of our members in your team to help advise throughout the life cycle of the project. So what you'll see here is I'll just use for pilot project to full project 1. So Dr. Odedna is the PI and Dr. Young is the MAMS representative. So we will all participate in reviewing materials, but Dr. Young will serve as the point person and she'll be more fully engaged with the project team, attending some of their meetings and being that liaison between the study team. And we find that model works very well. So you'll see that we've kind of split these evenly across the 3 co-leads. And as projects come to us, we will identify who makes the most sense to be the representative on that study team. So just some suggestions on how to work with MAMS on the pilot full projects. What I will stress, and we can't stress this enough, is to contact us early in the planning stage. If you're approaching us to review your materials as you're about to submit to the IRB, that's too late. That's way too late. So we can have a lot of guidance on the whole design of the study, your selection of the modes of administration, the protocol, the cadence of administration. So all of these decisions happen early on in a study. So please contact us early so we can get embedded with your team, get a really good overall sense of what your objectives are, and that will make us better suited to give you valuable guidance on your measurement tools. In phase 1, we thought about coming up with a process where you could submit an intake form and get onto our queue, but the requests are so infrequent that it didn't make sense to have a complicated intake process. So really, it's pretty simple. Just send a request to Calissa suggesting that you would like our input, and then she will coordinate that communication with us. We'll assign one person to your team. And again, it's not just for that initial consultation, but we can also be involved in the implementation, interpretation, and the whole life cycle of your study. We are here as a resource for you, so please use our expertise. So with that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Catherine Lodobiembo, and if she's available, she can describe this one slide for you on special considerations of working with MAMS on international studies. Emelina, I'm not sure if you've seen her come into the meeting yet. Okay, it's a very big time difference. She is not in the US, so I know that's a big difference in time. So I'll go ahead and.
It's on, Dr. Yes. Just
Okay,
one second.
okay. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Yes, I wasn't able to unmute, but now I've been able to do that. Thank you very much, Dr. Yud. So, for the special consideration for studies that are going to be done in Africa, one of the things that we need to consider is that our studies also follows the same, the minimum requirements required for studies done in the US. If you look at that chart that Dr. Yus just presented, based on the social, the socioeconomic, the social demographic variables and other variables that we have to use in our instrument, we follow the same pattern. One of the things that we have been able to do is to standardize across the Caribbean, Africa, and the US our instruments, such that by the time we are through with data collection, we can have a basis for comparison. So basically, what we're trying to say is that when you're collecting your data in Africa, you don't necessarily have to use a new scale of determining some of those variables. So just follow the same pattern as it's used in the US. One other thing that we also need to consider in doing studies in Africa is the issue of language. There's some communities, if you have to collect data in some communities, we may need to do some translation. And so, just like Dr. Yo said, you will need to contact us early. It's not at the point of getting your IRB that you'll start informing us, because the process of translating into our local languages takes a long time. So we need enough time from our scientists to be able to achieve that. So for our instruments that we know that needs to be translated, especially those that the interviewers may need to read out to the respondent, you need to send them to us on time for the process of translation. One other thing that we also need to take note in conducting research in Africa is the fact that we need to be culturally sensitive to our environment. There are a lot of cultural issues that we need to put into consideration when we are collecting data in Africa. Basically, because of the kind of environment where we are in, there are certain ways that you can't ask some questions. It sounds rude and disrespectful. So we may need to also put that into consideration when we are developing our instruments and sending it to us, so that those cultural beliefs and cultural practices also needs to be put in place. Most importantly, for African studies that we are conducting, we want to plead with us that we ensure best practices in all that we do, best practices in the development of the instrument, best practices in the data collection, and ensuring that the MAMS score is carried along in all our studies. In our care phase one of the challenges we had was some of the pilot projects that were carried out. The instruments that were used did not pass through MAMS score. Some of them were, though some of the instruments were standard instrument, but for the purpose of being able to compare data across board, across Africa, across West Africa, together with the US and the Caribbean. Most importantly, we need to ensure that in collecting some of those, before we go to the field to collect the data, the instrument needs to be sent to MAMS, especially for us to be able to ensure that the instrument, tallies with what we have standardized for other pilot projects under the ICARE phase 2, so that we don't have data that cannot be compared between, even within Africa and across Africa to the US. So basically, those are some of the things that we need to put into consideration when we are conducting studies here in Africa. And from the table that we have seen, we will see that Dr. Rotimi's led project and Dr. Otero's led project are the project that I will be part of the MAMS call. So please, the PIs involved, please, before the vitamin A trial study. And so before we start data collection at all, please, let's ensure that the MAMS score is carried along at every step of our data collection. Thank you, Colisa. So I'm going to hand over to Dr. Yates now to continue from there. Great,
thank you so much. Yes, and I think one thing to also comment on is I've heard some investigators say let's send our things to MAMS for approval. So MAMS doesn't approve. We don't have that sort of authority. Really, we're just here to assist, and we can recommend. But it's important to have that engagement so that we can provide recommendations and try to get that harmonization. You all, as the investigators, are the subject matter experts, so that's why there's no approval. If you have a reason why you want to deviate from our recommendation, that's fine, but we want to make sure that you at least hear what we have to offer in terms of the review of your materials. So Dr. Olodiumbo's last bullet was a great lead into the next set of slides, which is our best practices, our goal 3 of our core. So we have, the evaluation, which is going to be an ongoing throughout the phase 2 and phase 1 of the project. And then in terms of the best practice documents, we've made quite a lot of progress here. And please, if it's relevant to your study, then we can work with you to become more aware and familiar with those guidelines. So we're going to go into these in detail. I'm going to just talk about them right now on this slide, and then we'll go over them in more detail. So there's a best practice for qualitative research, best practices for focus groups, which is a method of qualitative research, as is writing interview guides for the more one-on-one interviews. Then so Dr. Young will go through those, and then I'll go through some best practices for quantitative survey development and administration, and then some recommended methodology for cross-cultural and cross-linguistic adaptation of measures. And then finally, on the goal 3, we're not going to talk much about the scholarship and dissemination because we don't have a lot to report yet, but please do know that we are here for that purpose as well. We haven't had any requests come in for help with grant writing, manuscript writing. Maybe we're not at that point yet, but for the grant writing, for sure, we can help you make sure that your qualitative and quantitative methodology, and especially any adaptation that you have to do, is well described in the grant application. So please do use us for that service as well. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Young to talk about best practices for qualitative research, and just let me know, Dr. Young, when to advance your slides.
I will. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Yost. So in preparing a best practices document for qualitative research, those of you who are qualitative researchers know how challenging the field is. And if you get a group of qualitative researchers in a room and you ask them about best practices, probably 3 months from now, we would still be arguing because it depends a lot on the approach that's chosen and the specific research questions you're trying to answer. And each of these approaches really has a set of expectations and maybe has some guidelines, maybe not. If it's more free-flowing and not so positivist in its tradition. But in this best practices document, what I have done is to try to work over those issues. I've chosen approach and discussions about which approach is best done, that kind of thing, and looked at how the literature in health education and health science has relied basically for some time now on the Tong, Sainsbury, and Craig criteria, the COREG checklist, which is a 32-item checklist. And they've reviewed a lot of qualitative studies to look for common elements and then made their checklist out of that elements. And so I've taken these elements, and in my document, I describe each one, but I also talk about what might be missing from Tong and what some of the problems might be. But I've created this checklist, and there's the picture on the right is a sample of the checklist. So when you are doing a project proposal, is the time to work with this checklist and make sure you're addressing these items. And if an item doesn't fit your study, it doesn't mean that you have to make your study fit. It means that you have to be aware that somebody may be asking about these criteria, and you have to be able to defend the choices that you make. And so this checklist covers the research team and what we call reflexivity. This is how we deal with the subjectivity of our research, the basic study design, and data analysis. What I've learned in working with a couple of investigators is that several cancer journals have recently asked authors to address the items in the COREG checklist. So this is after the fact, after you've done your research. It's a whole lot easier to address these things before you start your research, because then you can make some changes if you need to. But just be aware that this COREG 32 is being used by some journal editors as criteria for their reviewers to review your manuscript. That was a shock to me to see that being used that way. And when I went through my checklist, I added things that I thought were going to be important, and added some things for discussion. Finally, in our best practices research, in my putting together this document has led me to some 2024 articles by Braun and Clark coming out of Australia that basically say we are doing a disservice to qualitative research by using Tong. And so in my document, I've included the references and some discussion of them. But I encourage you to follow the current state of the art in our methodological literature now, to at least see what's being discussed. And as you make your decisions as an investigator, I can perhaps help you kind of navigate through what works best for your study and works to make it a good qualitative study that will be published in the future. Next slide, Kathleen, please. The next best practices document that I've been working on is writing questions. And we typically use a guide for our questions. Again, this is qualitative, so it's not things that are necessarily counted, but things that are described, experiences, perceptions, beliefs, those kinds of things. So we typically use a semi-structured guide for data collection. And we can do that in a face-to-face interview or even with a focus group. And we've done some virtual focus groups and virtual interviews, as well as face-to-face. So these criteria can be used there as well. When you do an interview guide, you're basically laying out your research questions and your interview questions so that other stakeholders, such as the IRB, the grant reviewers, those kinds of things, can make a connection between the research questions that you're asking and how you're going to get your data. And when we write a guide, what we say is that the interviewer or the focus group facilitator can vary from the guide within the parameters of what your research questions are and make changes, maybe in the wording of the questions or the order of the questions to reflect the language or the experience or the preferences of the person that you're interviewing. So when we say it's a guide, there's some flexibility there that we don't have, like when you're doing surveys and those kinds of things, where the questions are in a fixed order and a wording that you can't vary from. So we spent a good bit of time in MAMS reviewing interview guides, so I think we're getting our process down pretty well. Some of the things that we look for, your questions need to be related to your research questions, of course, but we want the wording of your questions to be neutral, not leading in a particular direction, very broad so that people can talk about what is important to them, and open-ended. So we try to avoid yes/no questions or variations of those yes/no questions. And we follow up with probes. So we may write some probes and we may use them, we may not use them. But when we want to remember if a participant doesn't talk about a certain thing, do we want to then probe for that a little further, even if they haven't brought it up? Focus groups and face-to-face interviews and qualitative research really do require cultural sensitivity, cultural competence, cultural humility. So I encourage you to have your advisory board members or members of our iCare consortium to help you make sure that you have those cultural sensitivity aspects of your questions. All right. Next slide. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is focus group research, because through the Minority Health Equity Collaborative at Mayo, I've been asked to work on some focus groups and either facilitate or help people with them. And so I think we need to put some emphasis on focus groups. People tend to think that focus groups can do more than they really can. So I am in the process of developing an online training for Mayo that'll be a virtual half-day training where you can take the training and learn more about focus groups. So that's coming. So what a focus group is: a carefully planned series of discussions designed to obtain perceptions on a defined area of interest in a permissive, non-threatening environment. We usually have 5 to 10 people in a focus group. Some people try to recruit more. I've done focus groups with as few as 3. If you get down to 3, you may need to just ask yourself if you're better off doing individual interviews, because what you want is some of those group dynamics and things taking place in the focus group, so that when people are talking, they're talking not just to the facilitator, but they're talking to each other and bringing out certain kinds of things. Your focus group needs to have some homogeneity of characteristics, because you want to target, say, particularly we want to target Black men who are survivors of prostate cancer so that everybody has some relevant experience. The group needs to be small enough so that everybody has an opportunity to share and large enough for a diversity of perceptions. Next slide, please. So there are advantages and disadvantages of doing focus groups. For in-depth questions, and especially if you're doing something like grounded theory or phenomenology, you want to do individual interviews. Focus groups can be time efficient because you can get multiple perspectives in a short amount of time. And again, there's group interaction that takes place. So if that's an important aspect of your questioning, then a focus group might be the best route for you. Logistically, getting focus groups together physically is difficult. We've got the CoLab downtown for Mayo, which is a wonderful place for focus groups. But still, you've got a lot of logistical issues in getting a group of people to come all at the same time. And if you've got a really sensitive question, people may not feel comfortable talking about that in a group setting, and you cannot assure confidentiality. You can encourage confidentiality, but you can't follow the people who participated in the group and make sure that they don't disclose. And the group itself may influence, the group dynamics may influence what's being shared. So somebody who's dominating, their perspective may be more likely to be heard than somebody who's shy and a little more reticent. Kathleen, next. So you really need to ask yourself, is a focus group the best way to answer your research questions? And if we're looking at attitudes, perceptions, and opinions, we're not doing Coke versus Pepsi, but it's a really good way to get some shared attitudes and opinions from participants. We always record the focus groups as the words that are said are our data, and we transcribe those recordings, and that's our data. And we also have field notes written by the participants, the staff and the research staff, and observations as part of our data for focus group analysis. And I think that's the last one for me.
Thank you, Dr. Young. Excellent presentation of the qualitative methods and best practices. So I'm going to take that over again and talk about best practices for quantitative survey development and administration. So this is a draft document. And what is a driving principle whenever I talk about quantitative surveys is this graph over here. It's old, but it's still the leading way of thinking about quantitative surveys. And it's basically getting this idea of total survey error. So each of these steps, whether it's from measurement down to the survey statistic or your representation down to the survey statistic, all of these little white lines represent a door where error can sneak in. And that can be either random error or it can be systematic bias. And our goal in using surveys to generate statistics, to generate new data, quantitative data, is to close those doors completely when we can, close them as much as possible if we can't close them completely, and if they remain open, to understand how that error that just sneaks into that statistic, how that might affect our interpretation. So in this draft document, I go through each of these steps to talk about how we can minimize the sources of error and develop our surveys that are going to be the most reliable and valid sources of information that we can possibly generate. So the different topics are going to be just the survey development. Where do you find questions? And first of all, you'd come to us, of course, because we have that core outcome set that we can direct you to. But if it's not, if you're looking for a topic that we haven't already vetted, There'll be some tips on how to search for questions that are existing or how to write your own questions with all the caveats involved with new survey development. How you format, that applies to both, electronic surveys and paper surveys, even interviews. What is the order of the questions? Because that can influence how people answer questions. What is the navigation? A very common thing that we see is presuming a certain characteristic about the population and asking a question that may not apply to them. So making sure that you have the right branching logic to direct people to questions that make sense to them. Throughout the whole thing, we're going to be thinking about types of bias and survey error. A big part comes into this measurement part right here. We have things like social desirability bias, where people tend to want to answer in a certain way that they think the investigator wants them to answer. And so we want to be very cautious that we're not leading the participant, and we're presenting the questions very agnostic. Like, tell us what you think. We don't care what your opinion is. We just want to know what it is, and making sure that we're not leading them in one direction or another. The way that the response options are chosen can also influence that data. We will take an eye to both traditional and novel methods of data collection. One thing that's fantastic about iCare is we're really pushing the boundaries of data collection. We're using some very interesting and very novel ways of collecting that information. So in addition to your basic, interviews and quantitative or web-based or paper surveys, there's apps and how people engage with other technology to answer questions. So we'll consider potential sources of error and bias with that. Data collection protocols. What I mean there is, what's the cadence of the collection? Is how often are you going to contact people to try to get them to engage in your study? What is the follow-up? Do you need to do longitudinal or prospective measurement? What modes of administration are you going to switch those modes of administration? So you might start with web and then switch to paper to try and capture more people. So that's what we'll take an eye to that. Response issues. This has to do with item non-response. So people who skip questions, maybe they're too sensitive, maybe they don't understand them, or unit response. These are people who don't answer any of the questions. So we want to minimize both of those types of response issues. And then this is another reason why we want to be engaged very early on, is the analysis plan and reporting of your survey results. We want to make sure that you're capturing the data that will help you answer your research question and test your hypothesis. Because at the end of the data collection is not the time to go, oh, shoot, I forgot to ask this question, or I forgot to ask it in a way that would allow me to answer the research question. So in addition to us evaluating that, we want to work also closely with the DAMAS core to ensure that your data are being collected in a way that will address your research question. So engage us early, engage them early, and that will make sure that your data will be as high quality and useful for you in answering your research question when you are completed with your data collection. So although this is draft, I'll just repeat that some of the topics are covered in our criteria for methodology measured, which is it's in our standard operating procedure folder, but it does touch on some of these best practices as well. The other thing I want to talk about, and Dr. Aloyimbo did already introduce this topic, but I want to bring it up again. It's recommended methodology for cross-cultural and cross-linguistic adaptation of measures. And as you see, my title is recommended methodologies and not best practices. And why don't I call it best practices? So sort of the same thing that Dr. Young said, if you put a bunch of people in a room together to hash out what's the best practices for translation and cultural adaptation, they'll still be talking about it 3 months from now. So this article was a really good review article, and although there wasn't one best practice that everyone agreed upon, there were a couple things that were common across all the practices that were considered good practices. And some of those characteristics are that you utilize multiple people. So a single forward, what we call a single forward translation from the source language to the target language is not going to hold up in peer review, and it's not going to be you're not going to have a lot of confidence that you have equivalent measures across the languages. So you want to use at least a couple people individually, or in a group, looking at that translation. Multiple steps and multiple reviews are also things that are sort of common across the good practices. What I talk about in our document is a couple different methodologies, and these are recommended. Again, if you have another methodology that you feel is equally robust, you can certainly use it. But the two that are most common in the literature for quantitative surveys are the facet methodology and the TRAP-D methodology for individual translators, or the dual panel methodology, which is a group methodology. So as you'll see, the TRAP-D and the facet are similar in that you have a couple different people working independently. And these are going to be people who are native speakers in the target language, and bilingual with the source language as well. You have another group or person that is reviewing it. Where they differ is that the facet methodology insists on the back translation and the TRAP-D says it's not necessary. So that's an example of where there's not agreement on the best practice. There's also some review, and then finally some testing. You want to make sure that when you have your final translation, you take it to a handful of people in the target population and ensure that you have captured the intent of the meaning of the question. It's not about a literal translation, it's the intent of the question. And will you generate data that can be compared across the different languages? Do you have measurement equivalence? So Dr. Oloruyombo mentioned a lot of focus on local languages if you're doing research in Africa. I think the dual panel methodology would be a great way to do translation for those kinds of studies where you have an expert panel who's bilingual and they work out what the best way to translate it as a group. It's almost like a focus group sort of, or a discussion group where they're sort of at a table sort of hashing out what's the best way to word the question in the target language. Take that to a lay panel, and usually that lay panel is monolingual in the target population, target language, and make sure that, again, you've captured the intent of the question, the meaning is there, not necessarily a word-for-word translation, but the intent is the same, and that you'll be able to compare across the different languages. Again, recommended. And if there's another methodology, we just want to strongly encourage that you don't use a single forward translation. Single forward is fine for consent documents and email scripts. It's not okay when you're generating quantitative data because you can't confirm with confidence that you're going to have equivalence across languages. So I'm going to wrap up with just some points about what our role is in phase 2. We're going to continue to serve as a resource for research studies utilizing qualitative methods or generating quantitative surveys. We're going to implement our process for early collaboration between studies and MAMS. So please reach out to us early, and we'll be engaged from the planning all the way through the dissemination of your results. So we want to be really true collaborators of your study. We're going to work on integrating our SOPs and best practice documents and sharing those. This is our first step to sharing those, but then we'll also continue to broadcast that information across people who need that information. We're going to continue to encourage standardization and harmonization of measures. And we're going to hopefully support your grant applications and peer-reviewed manuscripts that involve qualitative methods or quantitative surveys generated from iCare. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and we can have a discussion, and Dr. Young, Dr. Oloruyombo, and I are all available for questions.
I think we have some questions in the chat, Dr. Yost. I'm not sure whether you can see them.
There's a lot in the chat. Let's see. I think I saw one about video consent.
Yes, there was a question that mentioned, how does the use of video for informed consent work? Should this be sent to MAMS?
Yes, so in terms of the video consent, we can certainly review that. Video chat is very common if you're using a web-based or an app-based data collection. It's a great way because informed consents can be kind of scary, legalistic documents. So having a video is a much friendlier way to present that information to individuals. Traditionally, we have not reviewed and vetted and given comment on consent documents. I mean, we certainly can. We're more focused on tools that are used for measurement. So yeah, we can certainly look if you'd like our input, but I don't know that that's necessarily a step that you need to take.
Gina, can you mute yourself, please?
Can somebody mute him?
Okay, can I let me make a comment on the video consent. Sometimes ago we used the Iron Man study being carried out uses an informed consent using the video, and we've discovered that it has really helped a lot of participants to help to make informed choices about whether to participate in the study or not. One of the things that I really want to say about under the issue of best practices is that in Africa it's easier collecting data than in the US. For example, we collected some data on preliminary data on meat consumption, the pattern of red meat consumption. And we discovered that it was in Africa, it took us less than 1 month to collect the same data that it took them about 3-4 months to collect in the US. So, but one of the things that we need to be careful about is the abuse of the rights of individuals. People may not really understand what the study is all about. So very important that we simplify the message to them through the video, such that they know what they are getting into at the end of the day. Because somehow, if you look at the issue of best practices, it may look like we have access to respondents in Africa easily that will want to participate in our study, who may not really understand what they are really getting into. So it's good that we'll encourage as many studies that we'll be doing in ICARE Phase 2 to use the video as a channel of respondent making informed consent.
So I have a follow-up question to that. So thank you so much, MAMS team. This is actually absolutely outstanding. I think whoever is coming after you have big shoes to fill for the explanation and the best practices and the science and just breaking down what needs to be done. I just want to follow up a little bit on what Dr. Ladimo was saying. And Dr. Yus, you're quite correct. You know, as we evolve with the ICARE, there's some things that we said is needed, and then there's some things that comes up as we go ahead with the project. I think we really need to, and I think one of the good things that ICARE can do is actually set its own best practices. And, you know, I think MAMS can guide us to that. So for example, in what Dr. Ladimbo was saying, the issue of asking people sign the informed consent without really clearly having that knowledge of what it is, I think it would be good if ICARE MAMS helps us to research that very well. And are you putting out a recommendation, especially in low resource countries, where a little bit of an incentive could be highly persuasive in you saying yes, and the trust that you have in the investigators and the trust that you have in the coordinators could persuade you to say yes. Could that be something that a best practice of saying, you know, when you are explaining the study, a video should be, so that they listen to the video, and then could the MAMS take a look at that? And I think the NCI Center for Global Health would be interested in hearing your recommendation about this. You know, because that's what it stands for, and where there's a lot of studies, especially the genomic studies that are going on. You're collecting blood draw, you're collecting saliva, you're collecting all those things. You know, I think I would, you know, if the MAMS group doesn't mind, wants to come up with this recommendation, I would like to introduce you to our Center for Global Health Program Director, and you can really tell him about those best practices, and he could invite you to write a recommendation to be distributed to the work that is being done in low resource countries. So thanks for bringing that.
Well, thank you. I think we can accept that challenge. you're right. I think it should be reviewed. It should be vetted. There should be some best practices about consenting, and not just any group. I'm concerned with lower literacy, lower education. Do they understand what they're agreeing to? Do they understand what's expected of them? And I think we can all do a better job of making sure that potential participants are very clearly aware of what they're being asked to do and what's involved. So yeah, so I think that you're right. I think we can certainly add that to our goals of coming up with some recommendations and recommendations for sure, best practices hopefully. Yeah. I think there was another question about GEM. That's a great suggestion, Dr. Odedna. Most of what we have in our core outcome set are standard measures. We try to rely on those as much as possible, but we are finding that we have to write some questions that are novel. So yeah, the acceptability of home-based chemotherapy, acceptability of using an app for communication and intervention. So we can certainly, whenever something is novel, I think if we get to the point where we feel this is something that is that we have enough data, we have enough validity about it that we could present and put on GEM, that is an excellent opportunity for us to disseminate some of our novel measures that we create as part of iCare.
Yeah, and I also wanted to add, please do not forget the translated materials as well. GEM also publishes different languages. So it may have been an instrument that is a standard instrument, but if it was translated through the MAMS network into another language, GEM will be introducing and publishing that on their website as well.
That's a great suggestion. Yeah, we haven't actually been involved with any translations ourselves. There may be some that are happening before or outside of MAMS, but that's a great idea. As we become aware of translated measures, I think it would be great to disseminate those, because it is so much work to do a really good translation of an existing measure. It's a lot of work, and you don't want to reinvent the wheel. And what you don't want is two groups, so if we've already done it, you don't want another group doing it again, and then you have different, competing versions of a translated measure. Yeah.
I think Dr. Babel Johnson's hands is.
I appreciate it. I could not echo more the horrible second place award that will go to everyone who follows you, actually.
Thank you.
An amazing job. I wanted to just, I have a question, but I wanted to just say I've been seeing a lot of emerging concepts and work and questions and consultations about AI in this translation space. So as we consider these video and written language consultations, because there is a great appetite for use of AI tools to actually meet this gap, it may not be done correctly, but I think if we're going to take this challenge and lead in this space, that maybe we should consider that, or look at some opportunities to make sure that that the AI space is also evolving at the right culturally sensitive with the same criteria. My question, though, was about beginning with the end in mind, where the consolidated criteria for reporting qualitative research was introduced. Thank you for that document, by the way. As we look at publication needs at the end, one thing that struck me with that document is the need to, or the question regarding our translated material returned to participants for their review and correction. I haven't had the opportunity, except for the team itself reviewing translations. And so I would hate to actually not have that be a met criteria. And if you can just share, if we will use a 32-point criteria like this, what is the best way to do that? What are some experiences? How can I work with our consultants? Because we do have a couple trials that will involve focus groups and translated materials or transcribed materials.
Transcribed. Okay. Yeah.
So let me address the COREG. The COREG doesn't really include the translation issues. So I think you would need to look outside of.
I'm sorry, Dr. Young. I probably misspoke. I meant the transcription, which was
Okay,
one of the points
gotcha.
on there.
Right. So the one of the criteria in COREG is to give transcripts back to participants for review. And this is one of those areas where there is a controversy in the discussion of the Bound and Clark documents. There are qualitative approaches that would not suggest that you you do that. And for me personally, it's you know, what is the burden then on the respondent to to review and give you feedback on a transcript, when I think that the burden really is on the research study team. I think there are criteria for translating those results or giving those results back to the people who participated in the study with you, but they don't necessarily include the cumbersome, burdensome idea of giving them a 50-page transcript to review back. And so that's one of the things that's discussed. And so if it makes sense for your study to do that, then you would want to do that. If it doesn't, then you have to really defend your decision not to do that. But you always want to give back to the community in a way that they can then understand and process and help you interpret the results. But giving a transcript may or may not be the way to do that. So that's a really great example of a criteria where we've got it in the Tong checklist, but when qualitative researchers start talking about it, it just doesn't hold up methodologically. And so that is the kind of thing that I could help an investigator kind of navigate and then provide the methodological references to say to a reviewer that's looking for this in your manuscript and you didn't do it and you had a good reason for not doing it. How would you defend your decision to not do that methodologically?
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Young.
You're welcome.
I was just about to, we're almost out of time. I was just about to answer a question about specific qualifications for language translators. Yes, typically the IRB would like a certificate of translation, so you have to demonstrate that the people doing the translation have some training. If it's a professional company, of course, that's going to be the easiest, but that's also going to be the most expensive. As long as they have some training in showing that they know how to do the capture the meaning and not just a literal translation, and that there's that review process, that should be sufficient. But please reach out to me if you have any questions, and we'll make sure that any translation is going to hold up in peer review and also give you as an investigator confidence that you have equivalent measures.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Dr. Yost, Dr. Young, and Dr. Olendoyinbo. I will make sure to send the recording out to everyone. And
I did have a brief announcement to share, Calissa, before you end, if that's okay with everyone. But we do have another, we have an informational session today regarding to iCare pilot funding, led by Dr. Kaninji via StreamYard. I can share the flyer for our informational session. So you may have seen this within our listserv, but in order to join the informational session, you can click on the flyer link or that StreamYard link that I mentioned in the chat, that I left in the chat. And you can essentially, once the session is live, you can see it here, or you can add this to your calendar as well. You had Outlook, Apple, Google Calendar. So did want to share this before we conclude. Thank you, Calissa.
thank you. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Will that be recorded,
Thanks.
Emelina?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.